Hello and welcome to today's webinar around subgroups and market access, developing informed strategy. My name is David Sykes from PRMA Consulting. This is the first in a two-part series of webinars looking at the complex relationship between subgroups, indirect treatment comparisons from a more strategic perspective. The content today will focus on some of the dynamics around subgroup strategy from a payer perspective and from a manufacturer perspective. And then we will start to think about how we deal with some of these opportunities. Just before we go into the actual content, just a slide on the housekeeping here. There will be a question and answer session at the end, so you'll be able to submit your questions throughout the webinar. Please use the dash panel on the right-hand side of the screen. You can see this illustrated on this slide, and the questions will come in, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end to answer those questions. If we don't get back to anybody and their question, we will follow up after the webinar. So as everybody on the call will be very familiar, the market access environment is becoming ever more challenging. This diagram illustrates some of the key emerging trends that we're seeing across many markets. This series of two webinars will focus more on the comparator subgroups and increasing ITC piece, as you can see halfway down on the right-hand side. Of course, the webinar and the issues that we will draw out and the examples we will use won't just be related to those two pieces of the slide. There's a lot of interdependency between many of these issues here, and we'll touch upon those throughout the webinar. As also we're all familiar with, subgroups are a very easy way for payers to dilute a manufacturer's value proposition, weaken the value story, and influence the pricing negotiation. If manufacturers are passive, then there's an almost certain outcome that is going to be negative. However, we believe that manufacturers can use subgroups positively and proactively to influence better outcomes from a pricing and reimbursement perspective. We're all familiar with the key domains of focus from P&R and HTA agencies, whether those be incremental clinical benefit, appropriate comparators, cost effectiveness, budget impact, or the eligible patient population. But it's very clear that subgroups impact all those particular domains. And the basis of what we're going to take you through today comes out of this HTA health check tool that we've developed. And this is basically the items and requirements and questions from multiple HTA agencies. And we've been able to pull all those together and aggregate them all together to identify key vulnerabilities and opportunities for a product in development. And you can see some of the information we've pulled out of the health check tool here, which lays out some specific examples by agency of the description around subgroups and some of the key methodological issues that are impacted by this subgroup focus. I think there's a couple of important points here. Firstly, subgroups is a key concern independent of payer archetype. So it's not just driven by NICE or the Germans, it's French related, it's Australian related, it's US related in the context of the AMCP. So it's independent of payer archetype. And the other important part is that the requirements differ across agencies as well, both in terms of their complexity, nuance, and methodological rigor that's required to support those questions as well. So with that basic introduction to the webinar and setting the frame, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Casey Quinn, Paul take us through the rest of the content. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you everybody for joining us today. As David said, my name is Quinn. I'm going to take us through the rest of the content, and I'm going to pick up on the point that David was just making about the breadth and the range of the subgroups, and I'm going to start talking about what the drivers are of subgroup strategies and what the drivers are of subgroup data and analysis requirements. Starting with payers, and David was alluding to this, payers are the key external driver of subgroup requirements, and they're the key driver of subgroup requirements overall. And in our experience, what we found is manufacturers tend to miss this force, and manufacturers tend to miss the implication. So you see a reliance on regulatory data packages, and this will miss the pricing challenges that take place at the level of reimbursement. And I want to get into this. I want to start with a misconception that we often find, and that's this idea that a payer is going to be more motivated to seek subgroups as a function on the overall or the average clinical benefit or cost effectiveness. And this is a fairly sensible idea, which is that for a relatively high average clinical benefit, scenario A, versus a relatively low level of clinical benefit, the uncertainty around that is clearly more problematic for scenario B. You know, subgroup 1, subgroup 2, if you fall a little short in scenario A, cost effectiveness is still good. If you fall a little short in scenario B, cost effectiveness in my diagram is negative. But the reason why I refer to this as a misconception is that it primarily assumes that payers are interested in the average and the uncertainty around clinical benefit and cost effectiveness. And that's not actually going to be the case. What manufacturers are also thinking about in subgroups are appropriate comparators, standard of care, natural history, unmet need. The reason why the uncertainty and the risk here from a manufacturer's perspective aren't the same is because our subgroup 1, which appears to be high, could be reduced effectively to 0. And we see this time and again in some agencies. Subgroup 1, excellent cost effectiveness, excellent clinical benefit. There's a determination that in that subgroup, the treatment is something else. There's no data against an appropriate comparator, and the assessed benefit effectively falls to 0. And that's essentially the risk that is our starting point today for all of this work. So the other main driver is obviously the manufacturer. So payers are motivated to limit their cost and their budget impact. That's relatively sensible. Manufacturers are motivated to obtain market access at a desired price for the licensed indication that they want. And a reactive approach to this on the part of manufacturers runs the risk of what we saw in the previous slides. It runs the risk of letting the payers dictate what the subgroups are, and the payers dictating the rules of engagement with that subgroup, the data, and the analysis. A proactive strategy, which is where we're going to get to today, means understanding previous assessments, understanding what's most likely to be the expectation and evidence generated this time. It means planning ahead, even as far as trial design, but certainly for evidence generation. And finally, it means preparing an optimal triangulation between volume and price and the trade-off between those that subgroups might represent, but the price premium that might result. How we identify that, how we understand the benefit. And I'm going to start with an example here of CLL and specifically Zedelig as a drug that's now being assessed in a few agencies and has given rise to some interesting subgroups and some interesting assessments. EMA approval for Zedelig was both for CLL and follicular lymphoma, but we'll focus on CLL here. It has marketing authorization in first line for patients with 17p deletion or TP53 mutation, making them unsuitable for essentially chemotherapy, or for second line. And this was confirmed by the EMA in a second assessment. Now, Zedelig has been assessed by a few reimbursement agencies in Sweden, Germany, Scotland, and Australia, as you see in this list. And the notable thing about this is how the assessment broke out. So Sweden followed the licensed indication. Scotland reimbursed in second line, and that was a restriction following a request from the manufacturer because that restriction left best supportive care as the comparator. And then Germany, the GBR, is the interesting example because unlike the others, the GBR and IQWiG specifically broke out relapsed and refractory disease, which is what you see in these extra columns. And by breaking out relapsed and refractory disease, there was the established treatment pattern that prior treated patients have retreatment or rechallenging as an option. And that opens up a lot more of the comparator basket. The Germans required that, and that evidence just didn't exist. So what you see are these 2 columns where evidence was provided, 3 columns where evidence wasn't submitted. And obviously, for those who know, Zedelig is an example of orphan status and subgroups, but that will be a story for another day, not here. The second example that I want to talk about, which we find very interesting, is biomarkers, which are a key catalyst for subgroups, obviously. This example is interesting because it's the example of ipilimumab in advanced melanoma, but the biomarker is vemurafenib. Vemurafenib, as many will know, is appropriate for patients with the BRAF mutation, but vemurafenib's efficacy and existence exposes what I'm calling the biomarker negative subspace. So BRAF mutation negative, BRAF mutation wild type. And what we see is that even though ipilimumab came to market first, you can see from this diagram, using the Transparency Committee in France as our illustrating example, as ipilimumab was coming to assessment and consideration, vemurafenib had already arrived with an ATU and was able to be being treated, the result of which was that despite marketing authorization for advanced unresectable and metastatic melanoma who have received prior therapy, the Transparency Commission in 2 successive assessments effectively restricted that to non-vemurafenib, i.e. BRAF mutation negative or wild type, on the basis that in BRAF mutation positive patients, vemurafenib would be the drug that was treated, and the data for ipilimumab wasn't satisfactorily head-to-head with vemurafenib, and via indirect treatment comparison didn't meet the requirements that the French have. And there wasn't data for ipilimumab in patients who failed on a BRAF inhibitor who were BRAF mutation positive. And this is the basis of both of these assessments. And I think the ipilimumab example is a good example as well of something I'm going to pick up on in a little while, which is early versus late subgroup strategies, and the way in which a late subgroup strategy doesn't necessarily reflect bad work or bad development. In a lot of these instances, particularly fast-moving markets, often a manufacturer will find subgroups coming in right from the side in very unexpected ways. And the key that we're going to talk about is how you address that depending upon when the issue arises. And subgroup strategies, following on from that, are never as simple as we need a subgroup in inverted commas. They arise when the need is discovered, and the discovery of that need isn't always going to be at the same time. And of course, the nature of the need will dictate the strategy. Now, as I present these, I'm going to talk a little bit in decision theory or game theory terms. So there are 2 main types of this. The first I'm calling loss minimization. So that is mitigation against the risk or the loss of repositioning of your product by payers at HTA. And of course, all of the risks that will generate for reimbursement and pricing. So Let's illustrate this. Let's suppose we have a market in inverted commas. We have market size along the bottom. We have list price along the vertical axis. And this will give us our licensed indication. This is our intended patient population and our intended price, which is then met at this level of reimbursement by a payer-driven subgroup. This move from Q down to Q1, so restriction into what I'll call a dilutive subgroup. And interestingly, Zedelig and CLL is a decent example of this. What you can see between the insert and the overall is the general principle of this. The patient population from indication to reimbursement has been reduced. The reimbursed price hasn't changed. So there is a loss of revenue. And this is our general principle. Price is unchanged, reimbursed population is reduced, a dilutive subgroup reduces revenue and reduces the commercial outcomes. The second example will be on the other axis. So what we'll find is not necessarily restriction of the patient population, but heavy price negotiation. And this may be some subgroups, it might be all subgroups, but the effect is the same, effectively lower price. And again, Zedelig is a decent example of when this might occur. If you look across the histogram in the insert, you see some subgroups have blue columns of assessed benefit, and the red columns have an assessed benefit effectively of 0. And I realize I'm picking on one particular drug, but I imagine everybody has some experience with this. Some element of the licensed indication has essentially had its benefits taken away because of this nexus between subgroups, comparators, unmet need, clinical benefit, and then price. And this is the general principle behind that. The reduction in price for many number of reasons, and the reduced revenue again. And what this sets up is the strategy. What do we do about this? From a manufacturer's perspective, the loss minimization approach is understanding your intended licensed indication as a composition of subgroups, identifying those subgroups, what they are, what payers might want in them, helps you understand what the evidence requirements might be, and then you can seek to produce the evidence in each of those subgroups and shore up the entire requirement. Now, the second key example is maximizing the gain. So this is the opposite side of the coin, if you like. There isn't necessarily going to be a risk, or there might be a risk that can be identified, but the key here is understanding subgroups as an opportunity. So if we start with our same example from before, our entire licensed indication, except this time the manufacturer is the driver towards a smaller patient population at a higher price, i.e. a smaller patient population that has stronger evidence behind it, less uncertainty, less risk from the payer, or it could have more pronounced clinical benefit, more pronounced safety. There are quite a range of issues where this could arise. And the flip side to this, if you look at the inset, depending upon the proactivity, depending upon the time availability of the strategy, this is what can be done to avoid the dilutive subgroup. Because remember, in a reactive approach to this, as I said earlier, manufacturers lose the opportunity to drive the story, to drive the engagement. And what you typically see as an outcome is that the price doesn't go up. If a payer reduces your patient population, there's no quid pro quo for that. And so this is our general principle. A proactive subgroup strategy can seek a premium price in a narrower indication. And the important thing to consider here, there are actually two. The first is, again, it's not as simple as this being the strategy. Just looking at this, I'm sure you understand, there's a trade-off here where it's not automatically advantageous at, say, the clinical trial design stage to in this case, almost halve your patient population, that will have consequences when it comes to regulatory approval and market authorization. There will be a trade-off between the overall licensed indication, which could be larger in countries with freer access, like the US, versus the potential payoffs here that might restrict that overall market size. And the second key thing that I want to mention again is that the strategy is not as simple as predicting Q1 and asking for P1 with the expectation that it would remain, because that dotted box then becomes what you would be asking for reimbursement agencies, and that has certain other types of commercial and reputation risk in many countries that has to be borne in mind. So whether you're thinking about this and whether it looks like loss minimization, gain maximization is the better strategy, something that has to be carefully considered on a case-by-case basis. And the final point that I want to make related to this is preserving market position. And this is something that's becoming more relevant in relatively rapidly evolving markets in particular, but also in markets where we see agencies looking more towards group reassessment. This is a key issue. And the principle behind this is that in a rapidly evolving market, you will see subgroups arise where existing evidence is weak, where unmet need remains. And I have an example of this in a moment. There's an advantage to later movers who can take advantage of this and produce the evidence required, and then incumbent products on that market lack the evidence to defend that position. So there's a reassessment risk that can be proactively identified and defended against. Which leads to the next main question that we're going to have. When is a subgroup strategy also a good commercial opportunity? I mean, I've gone through these examples. In a few of them, it clearly hasn't always been a good commercial move to pursue subgroups. Now, I'm going to stylize these into three groups of catalysts. The first is the prospective market or patient population. The second is the product per se. And the third is the market or the agency. For the prospective market or the patient population, I alluded to this a moment ago, a crowded market, a lot of competition. We see that opportunities tend to exist over time in subgroups of that market. Unmet need might only persist in a subgroup of that market. And simply the fact that the market is evolving rapidly will mean that more competition will need to find smaller spaces to really excel. And the example that I want to talk about for this is hepatitis C virus as an example of a relatively rapidly evolving market. So if we look at this, particularly in Europe, there are 4 drugs, Alisio, Harvoni, Sovaldi, the cleanser. There are more in development, as many people will be aware. They've been assessed over the first half of 2015 by a bunch of agencies in a bunch of countries. And if I draw your attention to the June column, the first of what will probably be a few group reassessments, in this case by the TLV. And if you look at the subgroups column, through the drugs through HCV, reimbursement has focused mostly on genotypes, and that is based upon the available evidence, but it has also focused on some of the other issues you see around fitness, so fibrosis, cirrhosis, previous treatment, and tolerance to PEG-IFN, because in HCV there is still a lot of suitability and non-suitability and a lot of warehousing. So unmet need in HCV is a good example of where subgroup strategies can be beneficial for manufacturers to focus on. The second, the product as a catalyst, is relatively more straightforward. So this can come from prior clinical development, which is the mechanism of action, biomarkers being a very obvious example. It could be the safety profile, and this could be product specific, or it could reflect the patient population. And of course, it can come from just the registrational trial. and we see this in products all the time, the drug had pronounced benefit in a subgroup that can be identified and explored, and between marketing authorization and reimbursement, there is the opportunity to exploit that. The HTA agency is the third one, and what this boils down to is that in each agency, for a given indication and in reasonably local indications, previous subgroups that have been assessed will establish a precedent. It is reasonably straightforward, if not simple, for a manufacturer to predict what subgroups an agency is minded to ask for. So this section, things start to get a little bit more complicated. What are the implications of subgroup strategy for evidence generation, the operationalization of subgroup strategies? And we see this a lot as a company at PRMA Consulting. Subgroup data, subgroup analyses, demonstrably valuable part of the puzzle, but it's a lot harder to set that work up. And the key point to this that I want to emphasize is in the blue text here, how we proceed with subgroup analysis and subgroup strategy is entirely dependent upon timing. Subgroup strategies and the execution of them aren't facilitated or prevented by the timing, but what the strategy looks like very much is. And we can reduce this to a few key questions. Have you identified the need for subgroups in time to influence trial design? Have you identified the need for subgroups in time to influence the rest of the evidence generation that's going to take place? Have you identified the need for subgroups only relatively late in development before the reimbursement dossiers go in? And in this case, there's going to be some prospective and some retrospective reanalysis of some data. And this sets up some of the execution. So ideally, subgroups are considered before anything else. Early is better. Early is quite important. Many of the HTA agencies, particularly across Europe, either by precedent from previous assessments or explicitly in their submission templates, ask for pre-specification of subgroup analysis in trials. They ask for systematic review and similar requirements that need to reflect subgroups before the fact, not after the fact. And it's an important opportunity for manufacturers to pick up on this before anything else, so that everything else can reflect the overall strategy. Having said that, like I said before, the timing may not affect the evidence generation. So regardless of whether the trial design can be affected, whether the primary analysis can be affected, nearly all evidence generation is going to be affected. And that's because HTA agencies pick at subgroups from any of a variety of different angles: target patient population, unmet need, appropriate comparators, standard of care, natural history, treatment effect, effect modifiers, and that particularly relates to indirect treatment comparison, health-related quality of life, and then finally costs and cost effectiveness. What I've got up on the screen now is an example of early, in inverted commas, and like I said, early is good. Ideally, it is so early that the manufacturer can determine what the appropriate comparator is or what the appropriate comparators are. And the clinical trial and the trial data analysis can reflect that. Each point after that, you still have the ability to affect the trial design, even by protocol amendment. If that's an opportunity that's available, it can be a very good one. Late in that, you still have the ability to affect the main evidence. The systematic review and the indirect treatment comparison, I think, are the big parts of that. Those are time-consuming and expensive, and they should reflect what the reimbursement strategy will be. Now, this is an example of late. Like I said, late is less good. Late is not impossible, but late is less good. Ideally, this can be identified late, still in time to affect the main evidence. But what I would consider relatively worst case is right there at the end, where most of the evidence has been generated either very late in the development or as a result of the market authorization decisions, or even during reimbursement negotiations, subgroups have arisen. That will typically mean that the catalyst and the driver of those was a payer, and it will typically mean that the manufacturer is lacking the data and will have to reproduce some evidence. And critically, that means typically loss of price or patient population or loss of time to market, which is quite expensive. Now I want to change without much of a segue here to a key idea that I want to transmit, which is this idea of startup analysis in inverted commas. And this is a separate activity before and separate from what we would call evidence generation in inverted commas. And this list just has a few of these advisory boards that include clinicians and payers, international and not, early economic models, and potentially early pricing models to consider some of the commercial opportunities or issues. And the reason why I think this startup analysis is important is because it gives the manufacturer what they should need to know for the conceptualization and specification of all of the other evidence generation. So to wrap up with some discussion, picking up immediately with the startup analysis, it's the key idea that I want to transmit independently of anything else, independent of the timing, independent of the product, independent of the indication. We should acknowledge that subgroup requirements are or are becoming a part of the reimbursement landscape, and they need to be understood on that basis. Before proceeding with evidence generation, the implications of that should be understood. And I say this because the return on investment of the startup analysis is going to be very high, if only because you can do a much better job of understanding what projects you need to undertake, what evidence you need to generate, and the return on the investment of different types of evidence generation. If you've been able to form your strategy as early as possible, you'll know what will benefit you or not. And the second key idea, which hasn't really come through that clearly, is the idea of subgroups and subgroup requirements aren't necessarily a threat. You should be willing to take advantage of subgroups and identify the opportunities that they represent. Preparing to produce these should begin as early as possible to reflect that. And this just breaks out the 2 points that I've made. If it's in time to affect clinical trial design, all of the data can support the strategy. Even if that opportunity is passed, there is still at least as great an opportunity with the remaining evidence generation. And it's important to recognize that and not miss that opportunity. And then the benefits from this, getting the subgroup strategy right. What does it mean? It means faster launch with the required evidence to hand. It means the optimal reimbursed patient population. It should mean the optimal reimbursed price. And these last 2 points that I alluded to a couple of times, it means the best chance of retaining market share in the future, and it means the best chance of retaining the reimbursed patient population or the reimbursed price after any reassessment, and that may occur 6 months from now, a year from now, 3 years from now. It's the sort of thing that can't as easily be predicted, but is still relevant. And so last thing before we move on to the questions, David mentioned this as well. I will be following on from this in a second webinar in 2 weeks' time, thinking strategically about subgroups and ITC. What this webinar is going to do is focus in on a couple of the elements that we covered today: comparators, standard of care, natural history. And I'll be doing 2 things. I'll be drilling down into this in terms of methodology, evidence, and modeling, but I'm also going to be drilling down into it with David on what it means for pricing and reimbursement strategy. So everybody please come along to that as well, and we'll pick up on a lot of those threads.
Thanks, Casey. We've got a couple of interesting questions here that I'm just going to throw your way. So the first one relates to the concept of post hoc analysis in the event that it's a payer-driven subgroup request, and the question relates to how are post hoc analyses viewed at HTA by different agencies.
By different agencies will be a little tricky. The short answer is that they're viewed fairly dimly. The slightly longer answer goes in two directions. If you were to go agency by agency, you will certainly find agencies such as NICE in the UK is a very good example. They are a very prescriptive agency, very high methodology hurdles, but they take a lot more things at face value. I would say they much better consider honest attempts at analysis if you can demonstrate that a subgroup wasn't a part of the clinical trial for a legitimate reason and then had to be considered. That will usually be treated more fairly than other agencies in Europe, which have a bit more of a mandatory requirement piece where merely by being a post hoc analysis, the results of that won't be accepted. And we don't just see this with subgroups, we see this more with indirect treatment comparisons as well. There are very, very rigid rules.
Okay, thanks, Casey. Another question here relates to any suggestions for how you would argue that subgroups should be considered irrelevant, or that HTA agencies shouldn't go down that route of evaluating a subgroup?
Yes, and this is not really something I picked up on, but that is a really good specific example of the more proactive, defensive strategy. If you can identify in, say, previous assessments in your indication that payers are very keen on subgroups X, Y, and Z, it is a matter of presenting sufficient evidence, ideally specific for that country, that the key elements of clinical benefit are not differentiated in subgroups X, Y, and Z. So that would be unmet need, natural history, and then when it comes to your drug and how it works, trial evidence, any real world evidence, but also very good clinical plausibility and logic goes a long way for that.
Great, thank you. Another question that I'm sure has impacted all of us at some stage over our careers relates to the concept of subgroups being considered a niche by marketing and commercial groups. And the question relates to, in this context, what arguments should I be putting forward to try and influence the commercial groups to think more proactively about subgroups?
Subgroups are a niche in the sense that that's more or less what the word means. But I think you're right. I think it has a negative connotation because of this idea. If you think about those first few graphs I had, a dilutive subgroup is a niche. You've lost Q, but you haven't gained P, and you've lost revenue. Nobody would sign up for that. I think the key is articulating and explaining within an organization, if we take this on proactively, if we treat it as an opportunity, we have the ability even to cover both a broader population for market access in all countries, but then very good data for a subgroup that we can reasonably expect in specific countries. And from an evidence generation perspective, it's also worth saying this isn't especially difficult technically. From the perspective of what evidence can we generate, you still have to provide evidence of eligible patient populations. You still have to provide pricing models. These can be conceptualized and specified with subgroups in mind, as I said on an earlier slide. And on that basis, you're able to then look at the commercial risks and the commercial opportunities and at least make an informed decision fairly early on in the process. Do we go for this or not?
Great, thanks, Casey. Question here relates to starting early and thinking about the relevant size of phase 2 studies. And the question is, should the phase 2 studies be increased in size to be able to better detect a change in some subpopulations?
That, I think, depends, because I think that intersects with another trend that we're seeing, which is phase 2 launches. So I would say you couldn't consider that question outside of the question of, do we think we're going to try to launch with our phase 2 data? And that falls in the same bucket of, what should our comparator be? Should this be a single arm study? If you think that your results are going to be good enough to attempt launching, you should treat phase 2 as though you would face phase 3 requirements, and your subgroups should be supported by that data, because you're not likely to find it elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think outside of the context of a phase 2 submission, it's fair to say you really do need to be characterizing those potential subgroups and at least bringing that into the trade-offs around the design of phase 2, given that there might be very specific differential outcomes according to subgroups and also comparators.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, early is good. Early is always good. Obviously, building subgroups in has implications potentially for overall trial size and recruitment, but I would still argue that the return on the investment is very high because of what it can tell you about all of your other evidence generation.
Okay, I'm sure this question will apply to your econometrics training. A lot of subgroup analyses are often requested, which increases the possibility of a chance finding. What's your experience of approaches to separating real effects from chance findings?
There are two. One is tactical or technical, and one is strategic and a little bit cynical. If I'm the manufacturer, I've been asked to do this on the basis of something that I simply don't think is legitimate or bona fide, there'll be a good reason for that. And there will be then just a bit of work involved to do the maths and point out that any subgroup effect or lack of subgroup effect is a chance occurrence, and that will be a function of the data. That's relatively straightforward maths, really. The flip side is if the data is weak and I might want to support that argument, in which case this ties into something that I have seen a lot. The modeling methods that get employed are still a lot less than the modeling methods that are available to analysts and to manufacturers for quantitative work. I mean, everything through bootstrapping and simulation can really support subgroup analysis modeling, and I don't see a lot of that being done, but it should be considered.
Okay, quick question that I'll address. How does this webinar relate to devices? Obviously, we've just talked about pharmaceutical examples here, but I think certainly a lot of the principles we've talked about apply equally well to the device world, especially the more expensive volume-driven devices as well. And a final question here, I think, Casey, as we're running out of time. We talked about reassessment in the context of HCV and potential unmet needs subgroups. What are some of the evidence generation considerations that people should be thinking about?
So hypothetically, let's suppose we have a couple of products on the market, including mine. We have a couple of products coming. We have an understanding that payers are about to consider reassessment. The key thing to look at there is going back into the market, even building this in as a part of lifecycle management, going back into the market, looking at treatment patterns, looking at the eligible patient populations, identifying where unmet need remains is one, going through the assessments that have been undertaken and identifying where data were weak. Those are the two most likely parts where a new market entrant is likely to have superior data or a stronger value proposition. Those are the two things that would have to be defended.
Great, thanks Casey. Well, thanks very much to everybody for their time and participation. There are a number of outstanding questions that we've not been able to address. Apologies about that, but we will get back to those individuals with those questions after the webinar. As Casey mentioned, on the 23rd of July, the second part of this series, Thinking Strategically About Subgroups and ITC, will be presented. So hopefully you'll all be able to join us at that webinar. Thank you very much for your attention.